welcome to another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. This is your host, Michael Cross, and I hope to give you an hour of stimulating and thought-provoking insights from, well, something happened recently, kind of a sad thing, but I think it's kind of important to reflect upon, not just from an individual basis, but also from a societal basis. My father, he was born in 1922. He recently passed away. And, you know, it gives you a chance to reflect and not just getting into kind of a nostalgic mindset, but also to be able to try to see what kind of changes took place during his lifetime, you know, making it to 92 years of age. And I think the changes that have taken place are probably more monumental than if you packed in hundreds of years of change previous to 1922. And what I'd like to deal with as my main theme is how we've come to be enslaved. How the American public, well, not just the Americans, but I would say also Western society in general, but I'm just going to zero in mostly on America, the United States, and ask the question and hopefully answer, or at least get people to think about why we have become an enslaved population. And yes, at the end I will talk about things like NSA and laws and regulations. But you know what? You've got to look beyond laws. You've got to look beyond symptoms, which I would say things like the NSA surveillance programs, the government doing these crazy things, both the local level, the police level, the national level, and, you know, the erosion of, in particular, the First, Second, and Fourth Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. I think that ultimately it wouldn't happen if circumstances were different from a societal basis. You would never have seen people just sit back 50 or 60 years ago and just say, yeah, whatever, who cares? And so ultimately, it's not so much looking at what's going on, but what's allowed it to go on. So what I would like to do, and I think a lot of people can relate to this if you've got relatives that are older or who were born during this period that you still remember, or maybe you yourself are of this age. But I think it's vital that we keep in mind how America has changed and why it changed. And then we need to pass that on to our children and our grandchildren. Or if we get another 50 years of change in the direction that we're going now, you know, if we have this kind of erosion of civil liberties and so forth, it's going to make 1984 look like some sort of hippie love fest, okay? Because we're not at a good point right now. And with advances in technology and with more of a global economy, we could see a situation where, back in 1960, for instance, if you lived in East Germany, there was always that dream that you could escape into another part of the world. And of course, they built the Berlin Wall just after 1960. But even then, people still had this kind of hope that they could, a lot of them could get out. But what if the whole world would have been East Germany? Think about what that would have felt for those people that were living behind the Iron Curtain. Okay, well, let's just go ahead and begin here. I was just thinking, my dad he was born in 1922. And in 1922, the United States was in the midst of a severe economic downturn. It was the Great Depression that was coming up. Okay, 1929 is when everything crashed. So a child 8, 9 years of age, their formative years were when everything crashed. And he related a few things about this to me. That he came from a family of 8 living in Missouri, and 8 kids. And, they lived out in the country, so they probably had a pretty good living before the Depression. But when the Depression hit, he said that all the younger kids, their job was to go out and gather grasshoppers and other bugs to feed to the chickens. Because you couldn't afford chicken food, and if you had lots of chickens, they can't just get by on their own. You can't just let them go out into the fields because, of course, animals, but also people could come along and poach them. So they would go out and gather things to give to the chickens. Now, you think about that for a moment. If you see the way 8, 9, 10-year-old kids are today, think about what it would be like if you told them, I want you to go get bugs and put in a can to feed the animals. Because if you don't do that, we're not going to have eggs and we're not going to have meat on the table. Even if you were able to tell them that, a lot of times our kids nowadays would be just like, huh? You want me to do what? Well, in those days, they didn't have TV. They didn't have iPhones. They didn't have computers. They didn't have children's networks that would have come across those TVs that would have been telling you that your purpose in life is to make a scene. Make sure that the kids notice you at school. It doesn't matter, you just got dorky teachers anyway, so it doesn't matter about your homework as long as when the teacher says something to you, you have a really quick, you can come back with a quick jab at them, and then everyone in the class laughs, and you're the hero, especially if you're wearing your designer clothes and you're carrying your designer handbag. You know what? That is what is taught in today's children's TV. You don't believe me? Switch it on and find out for yourself. So anyway, it's no surprise that a lot of kids now really don't want to put effort and work into homework and also accomplishing things. But anyway, his age, 8 years old, when the Depression was getting underway. And his teenage years were at a time period where, it was survival. You know what? You were lucky you have one pair of shoes. You were lucky to have one change of clothes, something you wore to church and something you wore when you were out doing chores. I mean, that's the way it was. Most people still did not have cars. And if you think about it, the stuff around the house was, if you wanted dinner, you had to start dinner early because you didn't have ready-to-mix things. So people were always, the kitchen, mom in the kitchen, probably with the daughters, they're in there working. The guys, they're not sitting on the couch, obviously. They're out doing stuff too. Everyone had jobs. Everyone learned responsibility. Not like nowadays. Everyone learned that they had to have responsibility in order to survive. Now, one of the things that did was that meant that your children learned skills. This again, very gender specific for this era, but the boys learned from their fathers and also their grandfathers, because in those days the extended family was still quite common, where if you didn't live in the same house as your grandparents, there were grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, and so forth that lived nearby, usually within walking distance. And so therefore, you learned skills from, if you're a boy, you learned how to build things and repair things, okay? It wasn't that dad called someone up on the phone and asked them to come over and fix something, unless, of course, they didn't really know how to fix something. Most of the time, they knew how to fix the tractor. They knew how to fix the car, if it was a car, if there was a car in the household. They knew how to build a barn, repair a roof, fix the pipes, and do all manner of things around the house that most of the time nowadays we don't know how to do. Most people don't even know how to change the oil in their car. Okay? Most people don't know how to change a spark plug. Most people don't know how to fix something aside from, trying to start it. It doesn't start. You stand there and look at it, maybe swear at it, kick it a few times, but we don't know how to just say, okay, well, time to take it apart and put it back together. In those days, they learned those skills. They learned how things worked, okay? You knew how fuel would circulate through a machine. And so therefore, you had an understanding of those kinds of things. You knew what kind of, you knew the basics of building, whether you were a carpenter or not. And so you needed to extend the house, more kids born in the family. You knew how to add that extra bedroom. You needed a new chicken coop, you knew how to build it. You just went out and did it. And the kids learned those skills as well. But that thing about the extended family was very important, because with the extended family, you had a situation in which you had security. And, I'll tell you this much, we have kids nowadays, they're depressed and they're anxious and so forth. And I'll get into this in more detail later. But I remember reading an article that first generation Mexican kids, okay, and young adults and so forth, had a very low rate of depression. And the reason for this, the reason that was given, was because they had so many people in their extended family. They might have 8 or 9 brothers and sisters. And as they grew, maybe some of your brothers and sisters just don't relate to you very well, but some of them would. So there was always someone, no matter how isolated you'd feel, there was always someone who was blood that you could call and say, hey, I'm having this problem, because they would be the ones who understand. But then after the next generation, where the Mexican immigrants start adopting American Anglo sorts of ways of living, smaller families, middle income lifestyle, and so forth, depression and all these other things start to go up to the same level as the general population. But in the days of the 1930s and early, 1930s, I'm going to concentrate on 1930s first. In the days of the 1930s, people, when they felt bad, could go to someone. Maybe they had an understanding aunt, grandmother, grandfather. They had a brother or sister, or even if their parents didn't understand them, that they could turn to. Okay? At least most of the time they had someone, because in those days you relied on family. You didn't go and try finding some self-help book or something like that. They didn't have them in those days. So anyway, the extended family was very important. Often the culture of your family was passed down from great-grandfather to father, or great-grandmother to grandmother to mother. And it just continued like that. The traditions that were maybe unique to your particular family, maybe some little thing left over from when your ancestors came over 100 years earlier, some little thing from the old country that still was very British or Irish or Scandinavian that you still held on to. And then there was the stories and learning about maybe adventures and so forth that your ancestors had lived through. Still very vital in this era. And it made people have an identity. It gave people a ritual of initiation of sorts as you were brought more and more into this family. Not to some sort of vague concept of consumeristic modern society today, but more of one that centered on ideals that were more homegrown, natural, organic. I don't mean that necessarily just in the food, although the food in those days was very organic as well. But the sense that it was genuine, not something contrived by Madison Avenue advertisers to give you a sense of meaning if you buy a certain product or do a certain thing or, wear clothes of a certain design. Because that's what gives people their identity nowadays. Okay? People are starting nowadays to gravitate away from religion in the United States. And it's not because people are suddenly going, oh, wow, I didn't know the Bible said that or whatever, so I don't want to I don't want to be part of this anymore. No. It is because their identity is being ripped apart by modern technology, and it's very hard for your local church or synagogue to compete against the power of the internet. It's a lot less flashy. Okay? People don't sit and talk. People are starting not to talk to one another anymore. Instead, you'll have 5 or 6 people sitting, even students, sitting around a table, not uttering a word, and flipping through their pages on their cell phone or iPhone or whatever. That's pretty pathetic, because you know what? You know what you had to do in the old days? You didn't have TV in the 1930s. You had the radio, and that was considered pretty special. In fact, that was something that actually brought families together, because during this time period, you'd have like Franklin Delano Roosevelt get on the radio for his fireside speeches, and that really inspired people. Now, regardless of how you feel about Roosevelt's politics, he was a master at getting people to feel good. And so he united the population, and the technology of the radio enabled him to be able to do that. Okay? But still, it was a family thing. It wasn't like, Dad takes the radio into the other room and listens, or Mom takes another radio. Usually only had one. Remember those? I mean, you must have maybe seen something in your grandparents' basement or attic or in a museum. Big, giant console radios. I still remember my parents had one of these when I was growing up in the 60s/70s. And, it was bigger than, it was big. Okay. So, everyone had one of them in their households, and that was the center. And you could also say there was something interesting about that too, because of that. Music. Now, nowadays we usually have a situation where each generation has their own music. And it's not a music, though, that's genuine to your specific self. It's generated by giant corporations. There's only like 95% of what you listen to or what you read in literature, mainstream literature, TV, music videos, that sort of thing, is owned by 6 corporations. Okay, so it's not organic anymore. It's just designed, much of it now, much of the modern music, at least mainstream music that you'd switch on a regular station on the radio, is computer generated. Okay, it's designed to be able to be, when you hear it, it sticks in your mind. It's like an advertising jingle. So it's like a 3 or 4 minute long advertising jingle with no substance to it really whatsoever. Now, I'm not knocking modern music. I love symphonic metal, okay, and a lot of goth metal. I like it, okay, very much so. But it's something that's its own little genre. It's not mainstream. It's not something you would switch on and hear, usually on mainstream stations. At least it still has some substance where there's a message to it. There's I wonder what they mean by this and this and this. It's not something about someone singing about their rear end. I can't believe that. Even at church dances, you'll get like people hear this kind of music where someone's singing about their booty or something like that, and they're making references to a few other things, kind of in that general vicinity. And, I guess the church leaders like it because they don't understand what they're talking about, and so the kids are out there dancing to it, and everyone's all happy. But if you turned on some sort of rock music, they'd be like, this brings in a bad spirit. Well, yeah. Well, I guess for the last couple generations, younger people have known something that the older ones don't, but then the older ones get older, and they still think that they know better. But anyway, what we have degenerated now into this kind of music that is synthesized for our listening pleasure, to keep us listening, so we will listen to the commercials on that particular station. Now, not all bands are this way, but much of it is now. At least pop music seems to be that way. But everyone has their own stuff. You might have in a family of 5, let's say a mom, dad, and 3 kids. Now, we should have more of those, larger families. Nowadays, 3 is a large family. But let's say we have mom, dad, and 3 kids. Dad might be listening to country on his headphones while in the same room, whereas mom's listening to the easy listening station. Oldest daughter's listening to Britney Spears. Next oldest daughter is listening to Miley Cyrus. And the son is, listening to some sort of death metal. I don't know, whatever. But in the 1930s, everyone came around and they ate dinner together. They usually listened to the same music, which was very regional in those days. So I guess in Missouri it would be country. It would have to have some sort of country flavor to it. But again, it could be very, very regional and not so much national yet, because the radio was just starting to kind of acculturate us into this idea of everyone everywhere in the country listening to the same thing. But anyway, again, the culture was one in which you, your friends, your community generally were kind of into the same thing, generally the same kind of traditions, the same kind of ideas on life, and so forth. Your neighborhood meant way more than just, okay, these people live next to me. They were kind of an extended family. They went to the same church. They went to the same activities. So if you said there was going to be a big potluck taking place for the 4th of July holiday, then you pretty much knew that everyone in your neighborhood was going to be there. All right? And I don't think we have that so much anymore. So you had the family, the extended family, and then the extended community. Now, thinking about the Depression, though, the one thing I will point out, which is a huge difference between now and then, was no one looked at jobs in that glitzy sort of way. Yeah, there might be some starlets that were like, oh, I want to be a Marlene Dietrich or something like that, a Greta Garbo. I'm not sure if that was 1940s or whatever, but you know, they would go off to Hollywood, but that was still a very small minority of starry-eyed young women running off for that. Now we have a whole generation of starry-eyed girls who think this is all a possibility. Just like it used to be, guys were all like, I'm going to be in the NBA. The guy's like 5'5", plays basketball pretty okay. It actually makes a few baskets during games against the opposing team in that particular community. But not NBA material, but yet still was dreaming like this. Well, yeah, now we have lots of girls who think I'm going to make it, I'm going to go and be a great singer or dancer or something like that. But let's go back to the 1930s and just before the war. Most people, when they got a job, were very happy to have the job, and there was a certain amount of loyalty. But there was an idea that if you had a good work ethic, that you could make it. Okay? And, if you were willing to go out there and sweat a little bit, you weren't really worried about the job you had. You were just dang lucky to have that job. And so, because you know what? It wasn't like, oh, I've got this job, I'm so much better than you are in those days so much. It was more of the idea that I've got a job because I need to support my family. Okay, see, you didn't look at like, I've got a career, I've got this. And I'm shooting this at men and women both, okay? I got this job here, I'm so cool, and that sort of thing. Most people, it was like, I got a job, it brings food home, it feeds my family. Because you know what? I want to have a family. I want to be able to have, if you're a guy, I want to have a wife, I want to have kids, I want to be able to support them. And that's why you had work. You didn't have, like nowadays, you have a career that you hope that someday you can fit a husband or wife or children into. Okay? That's a fairly recent phenomena. Whereas in those days, it was, I'm going to make some money. So actually, to a degree, if you watch these old movies, for instance, from that era, and you'll see like a 55-year-old guy collecting tickets at the movie theater. If it's a movie set in the 1940s, for instance, even 1930s, 1940s, even in the 1950s, and you're thinking, whoa, isn't that a job that was only like some 16 or 17-year-old kid would be doing instead? No, in those days, it didn't matter, it wasn't so much segregated like, oh, well, this is not something that a regular adult male would do. It was instead, you got offered the job, you might try to find something better that paid more, but it wasn't so much the status. It was that you just had a good job and you were willing to work long hours in order to support your family. So they didn't go hungry and they had clothes on their backs and so forth. Okay? And I think that's actually a healthier way of looking at it. There's a lot of people, a lot of men nowadays, they reach 40 or 50 and they look around, and especially now with Facebook, they see some of their people maybe they've added from high school. You know, they haven't seen them since high school, but they add them anyway just to kind of see how they're doing, comparing themselves. And, you know, their friend from high school is, you know, making $300,000 a year, lives in a nice home, and has a 20-year-old wife. You know, even though he's like 55. And you're looking at your little, you know, you're looking at your little house that's not in the best area of town, and your wife's a little on the older side, and your kids are not exactly doing as you want them to be doing, and so forth. So you don't have this glitzy Facebook look at me type lifestyle, and so you feel bad, you feel negative, and this is felt by many men and also now women. When they reach a certain stage of life, they're thinking, I've totally failed. You know, in the old days, you didn't really totally fail as long as you were bringing food home. Okay? I'm not saying that there wasn't any kind of social status and that kind of thing, but it wasn't quite the same as it is today. Now, and we'll get into why that is. But now, the one thing that was kind of interesting was, in this era, you really appreciated what you have. Now, I was in Uganda last year, in Kampala, Uganda, and I visited a school, and they had classes of girls. It was a girls' school, Christian school, and they had classes that numbered, oh my gosh, you know, you might have 50 or 60 young women in the same classroom. Okay? Some of them didn't have shoes, but they really were trying to learn. They were doing their darndest to make something of themselves, and they respected teachers. They called their teachers professor. And if the professor was walking, you know, these are like 14, 15, 16-year-old young women. If the professor was walking down the corridor and they were coming up the other side, they moved aside so that they would not block him or her. They didn't expect him or her to move for them. If there was a lunch line, they let the teacher or / professor walk in and get their stuff first. And it was always very courteous towards their teachers. Now, the same was true to a large degree, not all the time, but to a large degree up until 1930s in the United States. That you had large classrooms. Yes, the teacher had the right to come and smack you one if you were acting up. So, there was a certain level of fear and also respect. But the thing is, in those days, the parents could be pretty confident that the teacher was in there to teach the kids learning skills. And that teacher was going to do their best to make sure that their kids were learning things so that they could use those for the future. For their future life, for their future earning money, and so forth. Now, the thing that's quite interesting about that, then, is that when you appreciate what you're getting, you're going to put more into it. So kids in those days, you take a look at the books they were reading. It wasn't anything glossy, nothing fancy. They certainly didn't have iPads to help them. They had instead maybe an assignment. Read this book. And then you read that book. And then you discussed it. And you answered questions about it. You learned your math skills. You learned about the history of the United States. You didn't learn about all the negativity of the United States. Oh, well, this founding father was living like this. I'll get into that in just a moment. But the thing is, you learned about the positive things. Now, some people say, well, that's only giving part of the story. Well, sure it is, but you know what? The way I look at it is this. Take a look at your own life. And imagine that, some tabloid magazine has been assigned to do a hit piece on you. And you live a pretty decent life, but you know what? You've got something in there you would rather not get out. There's things you've done you're not proud of. Now, what if the tabloid finds out about those things, and instead of writing about all the good things you accomplished, they instead deal with everything negative? They can make you look like a real jerk. They can make you look like some sort of hideous, horrible, evil entity. And that's what a lot of times schools do today towards our historical figures. I mean, every historical figure has something weird about him. Okay? Benjamin Franklin was involved in some pretty occult things. I mean, depending on how you want to define occult, I mean, he pretty much was in the occult. Thomas Jefferson, yeah, he owned slaves. George Washington, I could go on and on. But the thing is, in those days, you taught about the good things. And some of the stuff about the cherry tree and George Washington, that sort of thing, there's not really a lot of historical evidence that that's true. But these were things to make you feel a certain sense of them being role models. Nowadays, we don't really have role models. Well, we do, but they're not exactly, they're not really what, I would call them something like anti-role models. They're doing things that maybe you don't want people to be doing. But in those days, you made a huge emphasis on this person is someone that you want to emulate. And therefore, people are more likely then in their subconscious to think, well, what would have so-and-so done in this situation? Okay, so this meant that people tended to act in a more ethical manner because they had more ethical role models. Now, some of those role models might not have been so wonderful, and maybe you could deceive people. Everyone loved Franklin Roosevelt. Very few people knew he was crippled. Very few people knew about his sex life. But in those days, you could say that the naivety actually helped the people to be able to think, you know what, someday I want to be a politician. I'm going to be just like him. He's such a strong, dynamic leader. Okay? Now, again, I think that, when people do corrupt things, it should be exposed. But when it comes to everything just being the negative, I don't think that's so positive. Anyway, now, saying that, you would think that I'm saying that we should have respect for authority. Well, I'll have to say this much. The people of that era were a very stubborn lot. All the older people, I grew up with older people. Okay, my parents were older, much older than most kids my age. They were more like grandparent age. And the thing is that I could see the differences in the way that they saw authority. My mom she hated Richard Nixon. Oh my gosh, she despised Richard Nixon. My mom would say that if I needed to use the bathroom and the teacher said I couldn't do it, that I was just to go ahead and get up and go use it anyway. But I was supposed to be polite and ask first. Now, the thing is, that's, her view of government, people that were in control, was one in which, you should follow the rules when the rules are good. You should question. But the thing is, that doesn't mean you just get up and her phrase was show your ass, to the teacher. You shouldn't do that. And it's probably not a good idea to go up to a policeman and start oinking or something just because you happen not to like policemen, and then you wonder why you get smacked down for it. But at the same time, I can say that neither of them really thought that, they thought you should be very careful of police too, because they came from an era in which, the unions were trying to form. Police were often hired when they were off duty to go and beat up the workers that were trying to do strikes and stuff like that. I mean, people died in strikes in those days. And it was often policemen doing the killing. But still, this generation had sort of this, don't trust authority, but at the same time try to have a balance where you respected authority when it deserved respect. And so, that kind of got into the idea that kids in school in that era still said sir and ma'am to their teachers. And again, that helps when you have parents and teachers united, that helps the kids to learn. Now, of course, you also didn't have to worry, though, that the teachers were going to start teaching your kids how to be good communists or collectivist or to question the values that your kids are learning in Sunday school or at home or whatever. There was more unity in those days, but between all the community and the family. But the thing is, nowadays parents can't be so sure of that. And so then you have to teach your kid to be cynical towards the teacher. Well, then the plus side of that is you got to protect your kids from ideas that you might consider inappropriate, or at least be able to maintain your ground and be able to present your side of the story. However, it is an adversarial relationship. And again, I'm not saying that you should be teaching your kids, that they should respect and obey everything that teachers say or that police say or that politicians say. But there certainly was a nicer time when you could be sure that schools were at least neutral, that the government wasn't trying to change you all the time and manipulate you. Now, let's go on for some other things. Now, when the war took place, everyone came together. Now, I will say this: 95% of the American public was against intervention in World War II. It wasn't until Japan bombed Pearl Harbor that suddenly people said, "Hey, wait a minute! They bombed us. Let's go to war with them." Now, I'm not going to give a history lesson about that because there's a lot of really interesting stuff that most history books, at least at the, teaching in high schools and stuff like that, will ignore about what led to World War II. And in reality, Japan and Germany and so forth, there were things that if you leave those things out of the history books, you just think, they were just out there just destroying and just for fun. And if you actually understand the context, it doesn't excuse the behavior. It doesn't excuse things like concentration camps and what was going on in China that the Japanese were doing and stuff like that. It doesn't excuse it. But it does give a context to it that, will allow people to kind of understand that there was a rationality. I mean, again, it's not a moral thing I'm talking about right now. Okay? It's when Germany invaded Russia, it was to get their resources, even though Russia was their ally at the time. And that was their downfall. They shouldn't, one thing that countries just don't seem to understand is that when you go and attack Russia, Russian troops will be having lunch in your capital city in the near future. Maybe NATO should kind of remember that sometimes. So anyway, just going from there. When the Americans were victorious and men, young men, my dad included, he was in the Pacific, fought against the fascists and the communists, the fascists and the Nazis and all those nasty characters. Once they defeated them, they came home. They were treated very nicely. Everyone was proud of the soldiers, even though America had not wanted to fight, or at least not the people. Politicians did, but not the people. The people respected the returning veterans. And when the veterans returned, they were ready to, they had been around women for a long time. They were ready to make some babies. So we had the baby boom. And the economy really picked off. It really picked up because all of a sudden you had consumers that were buying homes, they were buying stuff for their families, and that generated an economy of scale that the world had never, ever experienced. A young, growing, dynamic demographic. Something that I think that explains American power. and why American power started going down. I would say the zenith of American power was the 1970s. 1970s is when America was still strong. America, a person that wanted to work could find a job. A person that had good work ethic, wanted to get an education, everything was possible. You could do it. I worked my way, when I went to college in the 1980s, I didn't take any loans. I worked and I went to college. Plus I was married and started a family. All at the same time. But in the 1980s, that was still possible. But the thing is, it was on the decline. Each year it became a little more difficult. You need a little bit more experience, a little bit more better connections, a little bit more education to get the job that the previous year you only needed a certain level to get. And so really, I still have to say 1970s was when, everyone still had this kind of optimistic attitude. Most people, because the birth rate in 1960 was about four children per woman in the United States. So those children were in high school in the 1970s and early 80s. And so you had this large middle class, working class demographic that was ready to get out there and do some good stuff economically. Now, the thing is that generation was still very family-centered, extremely family-centered. The people, everyone thinks, the 1960s, no, people were still very family-centered in the 1960s. But this is when the change started taking place, and a lot of it did have to do with the affluence that we were experiencing. You had the parents of that era had gone through the Depression, had gone through World War II, and they were now earning livings and living in homes that were fantastic compared to what they had been used to, and it was the good life. Even if you were just regular middle class, working class, it was still the good life compared to today. And the thing is that with affluence, the next generation that came along has a chance to kind of sit around and maybe start questioning. Now, I'm not going to say that whenever affluence comes along, although it seems to be something you find in the Bible a lot, when affluence comes along, that all of a sudden people just start, gravitating away from traditional values. I think that what happens is you get to where people can be comfortable, and then they start contemplating other ways of life. People in the 1930s, they didn't have enough time to sit around and contemplate the meaning of life. They went to church for that on Sunday. But by the 1960s and early 1970s, a lot of people were starting to question the basis of the consumer society, the basis for a lot of the power and wars in like Vietnam and stuff like that. And then some strange things started happening. Now, I'm not going to say it's conspiracy, although I'm not going to say it's not. But I'll tell you one thing. I will say one thing. And okay, I lost connection there for just a second. I wonder who cut me off there. The thing is that the cynicism, okay. Let me back up a little bit. If you look it up, you'll find out that the government, like through the CIA and stuff like that, did fund things like and promote things like the modern art. This kind of not abstract art, but stuff that just seemed like it was, what is that? You see someone tears up a piece of paper and calls it rebellion and puts a $10,000 price tag on it, and some collector goes, oh my gosh, that is so wonderful, and they buy it. Trendy guy buys the piece of paper ripped up, or you put a canvas up that just has a speck on it, or you have a metal monstrosity that looks like you took someone in the Starship Enterprise and you beamed them down, but something was wrong with the transport system, and so they beamed up kind of weird, and that's what the statue looks like. And it sells for tens of thousands of dollars. The CIA did promote that. It had something to do with trying to say that, in the West we have so much freedom compared to the so-called Soviet Cold War, Soviet realism. So take a look at what we can do. It's okay. CIA, look it up for yourself. Google it. CIA/modern art and see who kind of got it going. CIA funded feminism. For good or bad, still you had the government promoting a certain way of looking at life. Thomas Jefferson once said that it was quite inappropriate for a government to try to use your resources to convince you of a certain way of thinking or acting beyond, just normal law. But the government was doing that. Look it up, CIA/feminism. Okay? Again, whether real positive towards feminism or, sometimes it's hard to even have a definition. I totally believe in women's equality. But when you say feminist, some people have an image of a woman having the right to work if she wants to or stay home with her kids if she wants to. Other people get an image of a woman, I don't know, that has a protest sign, raising a protest sign, showing her hairy underarms and saying, who needs a man? That's their image. The word feminist really doesn't mean anything so much because it's so, everyone has a different impression of it. And depending on how they see certain issues, they see it positive or negative. But the CIA did start the feminist movement going. And now I can't believe that they didn't have, the government and foundations and so forth did not have something to do with movies and education and so forth, taking a distinctly cynical tone towards American life, the family, tradition, religion, and all these other things. 1950s and even into the 1960s, you always try to present a wholesome ideal. Okay? Your religious figures and so forth were always people that were sacrificing for the betterment of mankind. You always presented icons of U.S. history and many times European history in very positive fashion. But then in the late 60s and then going into the 70s, it became chic to start just belittling and making everything. Remember, if you watch movies from that era, they're just so depressing. It was nihilism. It was the start of there is no purpose in life. Everything sucks. Everything is just ugh. And if you are lucky enough to find love in your life, then that's pretty special. But often in the movies, something happens to where your lovers are broken up, and at the end, everyone's unhappy. 1970s movies were not necessarily the most happy movies to watch. I think maybe that's why Star Wars was so grand, because it came out of that era and it was just like, yay, the archetype, the Jungian archetype of the hero. And it did switch us to be a little bit less cynical, I think. Because it was a fairy tale everyone could relate to. But, and then there was other movies that tried to copy that. But up until that time, oh my gosh, even TV sitcoms were always ripping on traditional values. I still remember one episode of All in the Family where the young woman, whose the father was played by, Carol O'Connor, I think, Archie Bunker. And, the episode was that she gets pregnant, but she's wondering what to do with the child. And just the mere fact that this kind of social activism of, instead of like a movie in the 50s where someone at least is like, oh, I'm going to have a baby, yay, no matter what the circumstances, and I'm going to do my best to make this child's life wonderful. Instead, it started turning into well, maybe I have a choice here. Yeah, I got a choice. Maybe I don't have to have this baby. Maybe it's not such a good thing. And this is where family was starting to get questioned. Marriage was starting to get questioned. The heroes and heroines were people who weren't married or had no children and so forth. So we started seeing a real radical change in the way people looked at life. And believe me, TV we get home, a lot of times, this is before computers came out, people get home and what else do you do? It's lousy weather outside, or maybe you live in an apartment, you switch on the TV. I mean, yeah, sure, people read and so forth, but not all the time. They watched a lot more television. And this is what, their little eyeglass into reality. Even though it's not reality, it sure looks like reality, and that's what I see every day on TV. So therefore, that's the way things are. They just did a survey in America. They found that most people think that the percentage of homosexuals in the community in America is 25%. I'm like going, what the heck? Are they all watching gay porn or something like that? No, the percentage of homosexuals in the U.S. population, according to every poll I've seen, is about 4%. 4%. But yet people see it so much. Okay, they see these events that take place, tens of thousands of people at a gay pride march or something, and they believe that the percentage is much higher than it really is. And so this is just proof that what people see may not be reality, but that's what they believe. And so if you see on TV how when you get married, women and men cheat and they do nasty things to their spouses, and they're abusive, and children are all just ungrateful little brats, and teachers are always stupid. I'm talking about children's TV and so forth. This becomes the reality. Therefore, it becomes the expectation. So is it any wonder why a lot of young men and young women are like, I don't know if I want to get married. They're scared to death. Okay? Especially since that commitment factor that used to exist in the 30s and 40s. Even it was reinforced by law. It was very hard to get a divorce in those days unless you had some sort of proof that the spouse was abusive or was cheating on you or in some way was just being really nasty. The thing was, or in those days actually, one of the spouses withholding sex was grounds for divorce. But then they came in with no-fault divorce where it's sort of like, well, I'm getting kind of tired of this person. And then all of a sudden the divorce rate's way high. You get blended families, of which, maybe the Brady Bunch made it sound like it was all wonderful and glowy and all these kinds of things. But at the same time, in reality, far more complicated. And so a lot of times you got, young men and women today in particular, they look around, they look at their church. Oh yeah, so-and-so divorced, and so-and-so divorced, and so-and-so divorced, and so-and-so divorced. And so what's the point? What's the point in getting married? In fact, why even go to church if all that you see is people at church living the same way as the people in the community? And your minister just gets up and gives a kind of a, feel-good speech that you're thinking, wow, this is just like Dr. Phil with some, amens thrown in. Okay? I mean, that religion back in the 1940s and so forth, I think really you could look at most American Christian preachers today, and they are more liberal, or at least less likely to be quoting the Bible, as secular humanists were of the 1930s. I think Margaret Sanger was probably more in line with how the average preacher preaches today. And the thing is that, this just means the society just continues to get further away from those traditional values. And it doesn't mean that people can't stop, but they have to be aware of what's going on. If your preacher is nothing more than, a daytime talk show type sermon with a few amens thrown in, why bother with that preacher? Go find someone somewhere else that's at least better. And, and one other thing I want to say about that is, I remember when I was a kid, my parents listened to country music all the time. Hated country music, okay? Hated it. But the thing is, they listened to it continuously. And there was one song, I can't remember who sung it, but it was something like I've Got the Pill that came out, and I found out later there was a huge controversy about that. It's about a woman who's like singing that, now she gets to determine when she's going to have a kid and stuff. And there was a huge controversy even in the 1960s that fundamentalist churches, Protestant churches, were saying, "Hey, this is not a moral song. This is against the family," and all this kind of stuff. Now, listeners here are probably going, yeah, I can't believe they said that. Well, you know what? That's what Christians taught back then in the 1940s, 50s, and even into the 60s. Look at how it's changed today. I mean, you're not going to get very many sermons nowadays about, we need to have more families that are big, and we need to, what's that scripture? Be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth. Or happy is the man that, they use an analogy of arrows. Happy is the man that has his quiver full of them, meaning children. You don't have those kinds of sermons anymore because, again, it's kind of like a daytime talk show speech with some amens thrown in. And this is why, people are like, well, why even bother anymore? Especially when there's more interesting things to look at on the computer. And people are, if they have a thirst for some sort of commitment to anything, they're not going to find it in most mainline churches anymore, I don't think. And, the thing that's kind of interesting, though, is the one other observation I have is that 60s generation, they tried to find something different. Many of them tried to experiment with the whole hippie thing and stuff like that. And then they got co-opted. By the way, look up CIA-LSD on Google. Anyway, they got co-opted. They got brought in, the corporations, they got them. They most of those people, became the greedy corporate leaders we see today. What's ironic is with less scruples, less ethics, less morality than the corporate leaders had that back in the 1960s that they were out protesting against. They became like liberals. You elect liberal goes out, stop the war, man. Elect him to be president. Hey, war, cool, dude. So the thing is that we've had this shift in our culture, and it really, to me, it's really sad that we've now gotten into a point where the world that people lived in, people that are still living that are in their 90s, or people that were born during the 1920s, that country and that world is so far removed from where we're at today as Americans today. But the thing is, does that mean the values that worked and were so strong in those days are necessarily old-fashioned and out of date? I don't think so, actually. I think we need to get back to those kinds of values. And ultimately, modern-day consumerism and cynicism and nihilism are all like computer viruses infecting your computer. And eventually they'll destroy all your programs unless at some point you get rid of them and try to replace your program with something that is far more efficient and works and ultimately gives you more satisfaction in life. Anyway, that's all I have to say for tonight. Hope you all have a great weekend, and hope to have you back here next week on another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here at UCY TV Productions.
The Anti-Media Radio, your host Nick Burnaby here on UCY.TV.